you can have local control over your school budget, or you can have tax certainty. You cannot have both.
You can't tell me that my kids in Barre are currently getting the same quality of education as kids in Stowe.
So we need the same folks who don't want to close their schools to allow them to be repurposed, reimagined.
I was not comparing the bill to what I wanted it to be, or even the bill as it left the House. I was comparing it to what was current law.
Hello, Vermont. I'm Andy Julo.
And I'm Joanna Grossman.
And this is There's No A in Creamy.
Vermont Politics, Culture, and Beyond.
Thanks for joining us.
Hi, folks, and welcome back to There's No A in Creamy, episode 11.
Yeah, episode 11. And if you remember back to episode 8, we had Senator Martine Gulick and Representative Aaron Brady as our guest. They voted no on the education bill. And today we have a senator and a representative who voted yes on the education bill. That is Senate Majority Leader Kesha Hinsdale and Representative Teddy Waszazak from Barre City.
Yeah, we really appreciate them coming on. Kesha is one of my own senators in Chittenden Southeast and a member of my delegation in Chittenden County.
Yeah, and Teddy, being from Barre City, is a municipality that has struggled to pass school budgets. He talks about that and how that factored into his decision. So we hope you enjoy the episode.
Hello and welcome to There's No A in Creamy, Senator Hinsdale and Representative Waszazak. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here, and especially to be here with Teddy.
Well, I'm really happy that you're both here. I've got like a little bit of a backstory I'm kind of excited to share because, you know, I've known you both for a while. And Kesha, I don't know if you remember this, but right after the 22 primary, I had a crushing defeat in a statewide campaign. I didn't run myself, but I was a campaign manager. Oh, yeah. And that was rough. And the first political event that I went to after that, I saw you at the Senate Vineyard fundraiser. And I don't know if you remember this, but you actually like made a point to pull me aside and shared this JFK quote that you had drawn some inspiration. It was really lovely, and it was kind of about what matters is like leaning into things you care about and your passion. And it really meant something to me, and I really appreciated that. And I've always just kind of held that in my heart. And yeah, it's just we all have to like appreciate our efforts in this world, you know, because like politics can be so divisive, and I just think it's really important for us to be like showing that kind of kindness. And I love that you modeled that for me, being a little newer on the scene. It meant a lot to me.
Oh, well, thank you. And not to mix presidential quotes, but you know, I think a lot about the Teddy Roosevelt, like it's the person who gets into the arena. You know, not the critic that's watching from the side. That counts. So there's a lot of great presidential quotes, frankly. Yeah. And they know a lot about winning and losing. It's never a straight line. So it's great. You know, it's just great what you all are doing. Many of us end up too busy in the political sphere to even dream of a podcast. But you know, there are those who definitely want to know more about how we think and how this works.
And Teddy, you and I met on the Warren campaign. We had very different roles, but you were out in field and I ended up in the digital team. That's
right. And, you know, as someone who has managed a few and lost a few statewide races myself, I always think I learn a lot more from the losses than I do from the wins.
Oh, definitely.
That's what JFK would always say.
Yeah.
That's right. So yes, no, very, very glad to be here and always happy to chat about what happens in Montpelier.
Well, we had episode 8 come out a couple weeks ago as we are recording this, and we had Senator Martine Gulick and Representative Aaron Brady on, and they both voted against the education bill. We understand maybe you have some concerns with how that was characterized. What are those concerns?
Well, first of all, nothing but respect to Senator Gulick and Representative Brady. I mean, they both are education experts, you know, have looked at this from many angles, are deeply committed to the work. I, on the other hand, am new to Senate education, just as I don't want to speak for Teddy, but he's new to Ways and Means. And I think what's really interesting about that is that they were really downtrodden about the process. And, that's completely fair. And we can go into that, but it sounds like they did quite a bit. I consider education like the fourth branch of government in a way, and one that we don't appreciate or give enough deference to. But I still feel passionately that this is one of the better, more equitable bills we've ever achieved. And so I just want to make sure, once I explain to people, even educators, what's in the bill, they tend to really open up to a bigger conversation about what's fair to all of our students. And we created a system we're very proud of in education finance that ensures the property wealth of a community does not determine their ability to pay for their schools. But we never created equity when a community doesn't have the political will to raise the same amount of money for their students. So we see communities vote very differently to fund per pupil spending in their communities. And that often is still related to their property wealth, their ability to feel, well off enough to fund their school and their students at the level they need to be funded. And so we've never reached the promise of Brigham to give every student equal opportunity and equal funding. And I was thinking of kids in Barre, in Randolph, in Rutland when we passed this bill. And I can't say I heard Teddy's speech, but I saw what he was posting on social media. And it was so important for people to hear that this is probably the most equitable step by funding every student equally plus weights that gives us the highest foundation formula in the country. We as Democrats, we so often, we're just really down on ourselves in our work and cannot celebrate anything. But I want to celebrate this bill because we're taxing second homes. We ended out-of-state independent school tuitioning and significantly curtailed it in the state. And we set the highest foundation formula in the country. And still, we are just really, really, negative about this bill. And I think that is something that we should at least pause on so folks know what's actually in it.
And I think too, similarly to what the senator just shared about, who we are as Democrats, we bill ourselves as the party of good government and good process. And one frustration that I have, and I was on the city council in Barre for 6 years before I was elected to the state house, is one of my biggest pet peeves is when we let process get in the way of good results. And we should do everything that we can to ensure good processes, to ensure that we are playing by the rules. But when similarly, I heard a lot of the critique of this bill be about the process. And just quite frankly, the only thing I care about is how this bill is going to impact my students in Barre City. I don't really care about the process of how the final product got put together. I care about what the final product is and comparing that final product to, it's not current law anymore, but the way education funding worked before H454 and after, it's not even close that this bill is going to make my students in Barre, who have one of the lowest per pupil spending in the state, to the senator's point about Brigham, you can't tell me that my kids in Barre are currently getting the same quality of education as kids in Stowe. It's just not happening, and that's just not fair. So when my decision ultimately came down to, once the process was done, once the conference committee was over, once we had a piece of legislation that was going for an up or down vote on the floor, I moved on past that process. And as Kesha said, nothing but respect to those who voted no, both whether it was the process or the policy. We always knew that this education bill was not going to divide evenly on party lines. It's a local bill. It's how the bill will affect your community. We always knew that was going to be. And so the folks who voted no did so out of their concern for public education in Vermont and out of concern for their community. I also voted yes because of my concern for public education in Vermont and my concern for my community. And so just for me and my decision making, my decision was looking at the proposal, comparing it to what was current law, and will my students in Barre be better off or not? And I chose to, I had some critiques of the process too, but once that was wrapped, that was no longer playing into my decision making.
Yeah, some of that conversation with Representative Brady was around the confusion on the House floor that day, and I do want to circle back to that later with you, Teddy, and just kind of get your viewpoint, what you saw and what you experienced that day. And they definitely went into some particulars that pushed them to a no vote on the bill. And bills are not clean. There's good and there's bad, and they went through the things that pushed them to that no. And we want to give you the same opportunity to walk through and talk about the pros that you saw that pushed you to vote yes. And I think that might be our next question.
Yeah, we'd love to know what were the reasons that made you decide to support this bill?
Sure, yes. So like we talked about earlier, there's just a couple benchmarks for me that I set at the beginning of this session for an education bill that I would support. It had to increase our per pupil spending in Barre City. It had to increase that per pupil spending without significantly increasing the amount we were paying in property taxes in Barre City. And we had to tax second homes. So much of this bill was about how money, and it's incredibly important, how money is getting out of the education fund to students. That's most of the focus of this bill. But just as equally important is how money's coming into the education fund. And the taxing of second homeowners who are disproportionately wealthy. So we're taxing second homes. We're helping those districts like mine who are the lowest spending in the state without increasing the tax burden, which again, in my community, which is disproportionately has higher poverty than many of our communities across the state. And the independent school restrictions. It is the largest restriction for money flowing to independent schools that Vermont has seen in recent history. And listen, I am a public dollars belong in public schools person. I strongly believe that. And I wish the bill went further and said, no, if you're going to take public dollars, you have to be a public school. I wish that that's where we landed. But again, I was not comparing the final decision. I was not comparing the bill to what I wanted it to be, or even the bill as it left the House. I was comparing it to what was current law. And we went from over 100 schools in and out of Vermont, over 100 independent schools in and out of the state of Vermont were receiving taxpayer dollars. This bill gets us down to less than 25. That's huge progress. And so those are the big things that really made my decision for me when looking at whether I was going to cast a yes or no vote on this.
Thanks so much for that.
Here I am going into my 14th year in the legislature. I've served in the House and the Senate. And so you have someone who's new to the legislature and someone who's pretty seasoned, still landing in the same place. And also, Teddy could reasonably say that his students, quote unquote, stood to gain. I'm in a community that tends to spend above average per pupil. And, I had a handful of constituents asking me, how could I vote yes if this could spell any kind of cut for CVSD, where my kids will go to school pretty soon. Well, not pretty soon, but too soon. And folks have to remember in the Senate, we also represent South Burlington. South Burlington tends to vote its school budget down more often. And my parents just moved to South Burlington, and they turned to me and they were like, we're not qualified to vote on this school budget. What? So I think you have to remember the status quo isn't great for our kids. It means, some pretty political conversations about, does our school district need more money? Are they spending the money well? Do kids need this or that? People get on school boards to not necessarily work on the academic programming, but to control the spending. And most states have done away with that political element to their education finance system. It's still very political in places that underfund their foundation formula, but we have Republicans and a Republican governor who supported a bill that says if you don't meet this education spending proposal in the legislature, you have to spend 110% of of what you're supposed to. I mean, that's with Republican support. So we will be helping to lead the nation in this particular conversation. There's a very uncomfortable truth that I talk to my constituents about, at a forum, the same ones who said, how could you vote against this? How could you vote for this bill and against our interests? And I said, here's the inconvenient truth, which is probably what made the CVSD budget go down, which was a surprise to our community. You can have local control over your school budget, or you can have tax certainty. You cannot have both. So this essentially says, here are some scientific, evidence-based reasons why you might need a little more spending for your English learners and for your students in poverty, and not even a little more, like a really sizable amount given our rural nature and how hard it is to educate just one English learner, let's say, in your school if you can't achieve scale. And so we are now giving generously to each school an evidence-based amount that they need, in starting again in a few years, and then ratcheting that very slowly. So this will take a decade to take effect, and is, I think going to simply bend the cost curve on many of these schools with a really generous formula. To a couple of the other points, we have the highest rate of second homeownership in the country. And that alone, you tend to want to tax behaviors that you feel you can reduce. And right now, we have a lot of communities where second homeowners are paying less than primary residents on their property tax bill. So this is doable. The tax department knows it's doable. And I look forward to the day where we are demonstrating, progressive kind of vacancy tax. And if people are just not living in their house, they can afford that luxury. That's a reason to tax them more. And it might get us back some folks who need to claim Vermont as their primary residence. I think all in all, this was a critical bill for Vermont's sustainability and its future. And I know people are really critical of the process related to independent schools. I think one thing I didn't even appreciate this until after we were done. But the independent school piece is existential for them. It's not contingent on anything else. The rest of the bill, people may have heard, we have a redistricting task force. It has a lot of education advocates on that redistricting task force to look at maps. Everything that flows from that, the foundation formula, everything else is contingent on the previous step having happened successfully and being approved by the legislature. The curtailment of independent school access and the flow of public dollars is not contingent on anything. It starts next year. So the districts that do have high numbers of choice towns or non-operating districts where they tuition their kids elsewhere, this was an existential conversation for them. And so when people say it came up a lot, it came up because it's one of the more consequential things we did that takes immediate effect. And I think that was going to be hard no matter when we had the conversation. It was going to be messy because somehow, once upon a time, Vermont got itself into the position of tuitioning kids to China and Switzerland and Massachusetts and Canada even. And reining that back in was always going to mean really big losers who were used to their own system in parts of the state that simply don't have the same number of public schools. And for us to make this change, it was people letting go of a little bit of their way of life.
And I want to leave time for more questions too, but just to circle back to the local control piece, in Barre in 2023, it took us 4 votes to get an approved. We did not have an approved school budget until September of 2023. And it was the kids, and under the old law, that would bump down our spending even further. It became very political. Our school district right now is Barre City and Barre Town are the Unified Union School District. Barre City votes for the school budget every single time. We always approve it. We just approve it by less of a wide margin than Barre Town votes no. So in terms of the local control, Barre City didn't have local control. We were voting to support our schools. We were voting yes. We were voting to give our kids more resources. but a different municipality was voting no.
Mm-hmm.
And similarly, that dynamic of, quite frankly, we had a bit of an illusion of local choice where, yes, we voted on our own school budgets, but the school budgets that were approved in Stowe, in Burlington, in Shelburne, in Killington were directly affecting the Barre City tax rate. So while, yes, we voted on how much money to put in our school budget, we weren't really voting on how much our taxes were going to go up or down. And so local control is important. Local voices in education are important, but it can't be at the expense of our children getting the resources that they need.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you both so much.
Obviously, this was going to be the issue going into the session, so I'm sure you got a ton of feedback from constituents throughout the entire session, and have gotten some since the vote. What are constituents saying to you?
Well, they really appreciate too, and I know Teddy can riff on this as well, that we also bring up healthcare and housing. At the end of the day, this is a demographic crisis. And these are communities saying, don't take away our school, our rural healthcare access, everything we know and love. Don't preserve us in amber. Let us grow. And that is our major challenge. The reason we keep doing these education reform bills is because we keep losing thousands of students in our system and going from 120 to 80. I don't know how much lower we can get, but I don't know how much our demographic bell curve can change before it is entirely unsustainable. When you look at our healthcare system, we don't have enough payers into the system that are of working age. When you look at our housing, we don't have nearly enough housing stock to invite families and working people into our communities. And until and unless we address those issues, we will continue to come back every year and look at how we can cut our education system further and further. So we need the same folks who don't want to close their schools to allow them to be repurposed, reimagined as teacher housing, as, both an elementary school and a pre-K early childhood center. I think constituents really appreciated being able to have the tough conversation. I mean, those are ones that come out and want to talk, but I had teachers email irate, and then I highlighted some of this information for them, and they went and looked up New Jersey's foundation formula and Massachusetts and some other states and realized, wow, like we really did the thing. We really said, this is what a real foundation formula funded at 100% should look like. And here's how we're going to continue to reimagine those numbers based on need, not based on magical thinking about just reducing spending.
Yeah, we've had this conversation with a couple of guests so far. It's housing, healthcare, education. I mean, these are all intricately linked, and it's unfortunate that we have to separate them out and try to treat them you understand the urgency, but we are just a citizen legislature. There's only so much we can handle, but it would be so great to step back and take it all together. Teddy, what are you hearing from your constituents?
Yeah, my constituents, you referenced my floor speech earlier, and it's the status quo in Barre is just not working. Per the story I told earlier about our school budgets and our high property tax rates. So my constituents, frankly, were kind of all over the board. We have a pretty split politically, nonpartisan, but a pretty split school board, folks who lean Democratic or lean Republican. And I had Democratic board members calling me and telling me to vote yes. I had Republican board members telling me to vote yes. I had Dems telling me to vote no, and I had Rs telling me to vote no. I had a couple of teachers call me and say, listen, nothing else matters besides getting more money into our schools on a per pupil basis. And I had teachers calling me and saying, no, hold the line. Any money to independent schools is unacceptable. And so it was a very, for a lot of things in Barre, it was a pretty 50-50 split as to what I was hearing from my constituents. Similarly, when I had that conversation of, let's forget about the process, let's compare what the proposal is to the dynamic that we are facing right now. Is it going to be better or worse for my students? And that, at the end of the day, was the only thing I really cared about. And when you look at it through that lens, it wasn't even close that it had to be a yes. And there are folks who, had a more expansive view of the overall bill and did not like that that was the only thing that I was focusing on. And that's a perfectly fair criticism. But yeah, so similarly, when I had the conversation and explained, also, I think it's a huge bill. It's like 150 pages. There are contingencies up the wazoo where Section 8 doesn't go into effect until Section 15 is a year and a half old, and a whole bunch of stuff that's really complicated. But when you really when a lot of my constituents looked at the substance of the bill and how it would affect our students, actually, this is reminding me of a story. We had, back at the beginning of the session, in January, I think it was, there was a rally at the old Labor Hall in Barre, organized by the Friends of Public Education in Vermont. And there was a gentleman who attended that rally, who then, in the final days of the session, was in the building lobbying legislators to vote no. And he was wearing his No on H454 t-shirt. And he came up to me and he said, are you Teddy? Were you at that rally a couple months ago? And I said, yes, I was. And I saw his t-shirt. And by that point, I had announced that I was going to vote yes. And so I was ready for it. I was like, yep, lay it on me. I know. I'm sorry. And he said, listen, I completely disagree with the decision you've made, but I know that your heart is in the right place and I know why you're doing this. And thank you for standing up for the kids. And it was just like, I teared up a bit. I'm getting emotional thinking about it now because it's what I really needed to hear at that moment. And again, reasonable folks can analyze a bill and come to different conclusions. But we were all just trying to do what was best for our kids and our communities.
One of the things that Representative Brady shared with us was that the experience on the floor during the House vote was confusing. And we were wondering if you could kind of share your experience. And I don't want to lead the witness here. I'm just going to say open-ended. What was your experience?
Yeah. So it was very surreal because we were there until the end of May, until almost midnight. And then the speaker announced, we have no deal. Everyone go home. We'll come back in a couple of weeks. What was it, the 16th, I think,
yeah.
Kesha, of June, knowing that we had a deal and that weekend, we came back on Monday the 16th, that weekend before was, the deal was announced on Friday. What you imagine that weekend to be like for a legislator was exactly what it was like. The phone did not stop ringing. The inbox was going. It was also interesting, just reading it. Because we didn't know. I had folks ask me on, the Thursday or Friday before, how are you going to vote? And I said, there's nothing to vote on yet. We have to wait until there's a conference committee report. Did some other business in the morning, and then we finally got to the education bill. And there was a procedural point made by a representative known as a point of order, which is basically, is this within the overall rules that govern the House or not? And there were parts of the conference committee report which is, for all intents and purposes, the ultimate bill we voted on, that were not in either the House or the Senate version as initially passed, which is against the rules of the House. So we had to vote to suspend the rules to allow the bill to be considered, which is a relatively common occurrence. We suspend rules all the time, especially towards the end of the session, just to meet calendar deadlines and things like that. And then so we voted to suspend the rules. And the speaker says, as she always does, the question is, shall the conference committee report be adopted? Are you ready for the question? And I knew that it was going to be a contentious vote. And I had my speech ready that I had written. I wrote some of it and then I riffed, as is my tradition. And then no one stood up. And no one started the debate. And I had a pro-bill speech, so I wanted to wait until someone stood up and said, this is a terrible bill. I'm not voting for it for this reason, so that I could stand up and say, well, no, it's not a terrible bill, and here are my reasons. And then no one stood up. And I wasn't going to start the thing off. And are you ready for the question? All in favor, aye. All opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it, and the bill passed. And there were some folks who felt that the leadership of either the Republican or the Democratic caucus should have made more of a point in starting the debate. We are a citizen legislature, but I serve with some really smart people. And yes, I've been around for a while, but it was my first year in the House. But I knew what we were doing. I knew what the speaker was asking for. I was waiting for someone to request, in order for there to be a roll call, Representative Waszazak, yes or no. Someone has to request it. No one did that. It was like, oh, we're just going to do this, and we're just going to let it go. And she called the voice vote. The voice vote passed. And then the place went bananas with people who, I don't want to assume intent, but I think there were just some folks who weren't quite paying attention. And the legislative process is complicated, absolutely. But it's our job to read the rules, to know the rules, to sit there and represent our constituents and follow along with what's happening on the floor. And so after that, the speaker basically said, so we passed the bill, and then there was a secondary vote to send the bill to the governors, because since we were leaving after that day, we had to, typically a piece of legislation passes and it just eventually goes to the governor. We had to vote to actually send it to the governor. And we were the last vote to, because of other rules, the Senate had to vote first, which they did, and then they sent it to us, so it was the last vote. And so the vote to send it to the governor became the de facto yes or no vote. And I don't remember, I have it written down somewhere, but not in front of me. I don't remember what the ultimate vote was. But I will say a majority of the Democratic caucus voted for the bill in that last vote of should we send it to the governor or not. So some people felt that they were blindsided, and I just very respectfully say that that's not their job. It's our job to stick up for our constituents, to say what we have to say, and to fight it out on the floor. So I think that it both was a bit messy, and I think it was a bit messier than it could have or should have been. But I also don't think that there was some grand scheme to deny the House the right to debate the bill. I think folks just got a little bit lost in the nitty-gritty of the rules and the procedures, which, again, this stuff is incredibly complicated. It's very easy and arcane. It's so arcane. And so, just frankly, some of these rules are just stupid. But they're the rules of the House, and we have to abide by them. So that was my experience.
Thanks for sharing that. We really appreciate it. So we just had Howard Dean on. A few episodes before that, actually, we had an episode about what does it mean to be a real Vermonter. That term I've always found super loaded and fascinating, like having come here from out of state. But we, so a few weeks ago, we did an episode about that, and people sent in all kinds of really like beautiful thoughts about how they enjoyed that term and what it meant to them, and also how it felt harmful to them. And it was just really interesting. And Howard talked a bit about how one of the things that is special about Vermont politics is that it's so small, and that we have the ability to sort of like rise above the divisiveness. And even when we like disagree kind of dramatically about politics, that we're able to kind of come together and always be kind to each other and respectful to each other and never make it personal. And I wondered, in like such a tough, divisive session, like how that lands with you guys right now. Do you feel like that's become more challenging? Do you feel like, no, of course that's essential? Like, how do you feel about that?
Once you get on the inside, you realize how politics really is just the art of disappointing people at a rate they can absorb. But I don't think that's a presidential quote, but it's certainly a quote from somebody. And, we often try to tell ourselves, vote your conscience, your constituency, and then your caucus. Some of the chaos I think that we saw was people kind of knowing where their constituency and their caucus were, but not having had enough practice locating that as it relates to their own conscience. And so, I was able to say, with emails coming in saying, vote no, we just understand the bill isn't good. I actually felt very, very bullish that this was a good bill, and that I could go return to my constituency and talk to them about it. And now my job is to convince my own caucus to do the same thing. But it's very hard if you are coming into so many crises at once, like we have right now. I just feel for most legislators, because almost all of them have come in since the pandemic began. If they haven't been here for more than a decade, then most of them started out not even meeting in person. And so we have a really big challenge before us to rebuild the culture of the legislature through these difficult times. I think people have heard enough that we try to get along. What people saw this session is that we were simply forced to do that in a way we haven't been in a while, but in a way that was very common for many of us. I mean, my mentors in the legislature when I got there in 2009 had served in the minority of Democrats. Nothing can be taken for granted. Nothing is set in stone. You actually have to know what you'd be willing to lose your seat over. And so, kind of to Howard Dean's point, and maybe this piece about real Vermonters, I often say you can't choose where you're born, but you can choose where you're buried. I'm Hindu, so cremated or whatever, but, where you choose to live your life and make a difference, even when it's hard, is what really matters. And, I would die for the values of this state. I also live for the values of this state. It's really special what we have here. And it was pretty much equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans who showed up to the bill signing with the governor. And as Teddy said, it was a very big bill. It was, it looked massive sitting there on the desk. We're going to have hard legislation to do again, but I'm actually really proud of us this biennium and this particular session for not shying away from the very, very difficult topics and the work that just can no longer be avoided. It's one of, I think, the most productive sessions I've lived through in my 14 years. And I know people are leaving feeling defeated, but that's maybe what made me passionately reach out to you is I actually think there's so much to celebrate about what we were able to accomplish with a federal government that is hostile right now and with, a country where there are very few models for what we're doing and we're still doing it.
I'm from Boston, right outside of Boston originally. I've been in Vermont since 2017. And the only place I've ever lived in Vermont is Barre City. I do unironically think that Barre City is the greatest place to live in Vermont. And one of the things that attracted me to living in Barre City was, quite frankly, the affordability of it. My first one-bedroom apartment in Barre City when I first moved in was $750. And I think about the other kids, so I was 19 at the time. Good luck trying to find a one-bedroom apartment anywhere in this state right now for $750. And so, like Kesha was just talking about, it's the values of this state where we want to be a welcoming place. We want to invite folks in. And once you're here, you're in. And I certainly felt that way. I moved in 2017. I was elected to the council at 21 in 2019. I jumped right onto the political scene. And so, I do also think that there's value in the lived experience of somebody born here and grew up here and remembers what it was like when Democrats were in the minority in Montpelier. There's great value to that because it helps inform all of our opinions and all of the bills that we help pass. The point is that all of these different perspectives are important, and you need the perspective of somebody who grew up in super rural Vermont, who has lived here their entire lives, and what that experience has been like. And there's value in, someone like me who moved into Vermont as a young person who could afford the housing costs to live here. Those are two very different experiences, but they are realities that people all over the state and all over the country are facing. And so having all of those perspectives in one building in Montpelier is incredibly important. So I don't think that one is more or less valuable than the other. It takes a village, and it takes all of us and all of our different experiences to pass legislation that helps as many people in this state as possible.
Thanks, guys.
Senator Ram Hinsdale, Representative Waszazak, thank you for your time, and we appreciate you being on the podcast.
Thanks for the conversation.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode.
Thank you all for listening.
Follow us between episodes for the latest updates on our socials at There's No A in Creamy on Instagram, Substack, and Blue Sky.
And catch us on our next episode of There's No A in Creamy, Vermont Politics, Culture, and Beyond in Apple Podcasts and Spotify.